Hello everyone, welcome to the Evangelist Garrett channel. Today we begin a new series on the future of Christianity. In the geopolitical context, Christianity is in part responsible for the rise of the sovereign nation-state system that governed the Western world up to the end of the 20th century and to an extent today. 4th and 5th century Christians such as Augustine of Hippo looked back on 7 famous writings from the 2nd and 3rd century apostolic father Ignatius of Antioch and interpreted his words in a very Hellenistic way, suggesting that he aimed to organize the church in like manner, with an eye toward preservation. A powerful minority of church leaders during the time of Ignatius gained inspiration from the model of Roman municipal and civil government, with its layers of top-down bureaucracy, local, metropolitan, regional. After Ignatius's martyrdom in Rome, his letters were later interpreted to mean that organizing the church by universal means was its best chance for growth and survival. This was both a result of natural progression and purposeful guidance of the small but powerful minority of bishops. Some records of antiquity reflect that fact. As early as the 2nd century, Church Father Justin Martyr wrote that during those first generations, individuals that presided over the church service were even called president, which sounds more like a government official's title than a church leader's. Like civil government, the medieval universal church also developed a system called canon law. With that came standards, best practices, rituals and rites, and perhaps most contentious of all, consequences. Those standards and practices did not come instantly, but have continued to be an ongoing process. The consequences alienated many sects of Christians up through the 14th century. The Catholic Church would argue it also ensured the survival of a faith that was otherwise destined for a footnote in the history books. A major split between the Universal Catholic Church and a group of Greek-reading biblical purist humanists we would come to know as reformers set the stage for the permanent split that exists today. Luckily for theologians and believers today, primary source records show in some detail what Christians of all stripes believed during various snapshots in time. That information sheds light on the influence Christianity had on the world. Many today would like to see Christian theism revived as the world's prevailing worldview, a philosophy that is in rapid decline. Until the mid-20th century, the influence of Christianity contributed to the rise of nations above subsistence living, the search for safety, food, and shelter. It was Christian theism that in part allowed for the development of complex bureaucratic frameworks, art, music, philosophy, cuisine, architecture, and other creative and academic experiences beyond the reptilian brain's focuses. The individuals responsible for the development of the world were almost exclusively Christian through the age of exploration. Christian values influenced the rise toward globalism during modern times. It provided solace and hope for those that did not have. It led missionary activity that brought food, water, and warmth to the impoverished. Now fewer people starve than at any time in human history. Christianity led to the development of social trust. That collaboration led to further centralization. Eventually, centralization and global social philosophy came face to face in the early 20th century. Since the rise of globalism and the influence of non-Christian players in the world collaborative, Christianity has been reduced to the status of a religion grouped among all others. In another sense, the rise of Christianity throughout the world had always been the struggle between good and evil, because it was the struggle of individuals against themselves. One can gain great wealth and possess positive morals and traits, but can also fall to greed. One can build a nation with great love for diversity and fall into slavery or genocide. One can rise as a self-made leader of the people, yet fall to the comfort of privilege, forgetting from where he or she came. In these contradictions lies the very growth of the Christian faith, which was sometimes an ugly and violent process. In other words, will the individual through the ego seek to control circumstances or follow the moral precepts of the Creator? The lowest moral common denominator continued to rise over the centuries because Christianity was influential to individuals who came to the public square to form government. By the time Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press came online, the explosion in printing exposed to the average person what can be likened to the technological advances of today, such as the internet and social media. One would think that the advent of advanced technology would raise mankind's spiritual capacity and the quality of academic discourse in our time. Yet today's people, for the most part, are hardly critical thinkers advancing spiritual thought for the modern world. Specifically, America's capacity for critical thought seems to be declining. This is such a problem because Christian theism tends toward critical thinking in a culture's individuals, which accompany a successful rise towards civilization. In other words, if unwell people with no God come to the public square collectively to advance government and society with no morals, no word of God, no Christ, the result will be anarchy. One could argue that is happening. Modern society bought into the reoccurring lie that mankind can master itself and build a great civilization without giving even the slightest credit to God or His designs for living. Mankind has become judge over the timeless actions of God based on inconsistent subjective standards. While mankind can breathe no life into lungs or cause the newborn heart to beat, they believe humanity should be given accolades for discovering what their own understanding tells them is the meaning and source of life. Today, many critics in reality lack the understanding to separate the value of Christian theism from the value of Christianity in its medieval religious form. Instead, driven by inconsistent and undefined utopian ideas for the collective, with no wellness for the individual, critics look to a small circle of institutional scientists, secularized faith leaders, and government agencies to tell them what to think and feel. That worldview relies heavily on a mass media conglomeration that is overwhelmingly secular to accomplish its ends. One only needs to look to every other civilization in history to see that instead of buying into delusions of grandeur, mankind should encourage the study of previous civilizations and keep an open mind about advancing intellectual and spiritual capacity. Every society with no God, or that deified itself, brought on demise quicker and accelerated the life cycle of the civilization. Events like the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, or the 2011 earthquake and subsequent tsunami in Sendai, Japan, are always there to remind each generation that what mankind builds can literally be destroyed in mere minutes, with few exceptions. Further, any sign of humanity's footprint can be wiped away in mere days. In another sense, our great computers become useless when someone simply unplugs them from the power source, or if a solar flare from a coronal hole in the sun strikes an energy grid. The seeds for the shift in worldview from Christian theism to what is called secularism began with a fissure in the church that began during the centuries leading up to the Protestant Reformation and still continue today because of the Counter-Reformation, globalism, and naturalistic materialism. The transition to this new worldview developed over centuries because people learned more and more about the level of corruption in the medieval Catholic Church. Many thousands of people up to that time did not even know there was a pope or what exactly he did. As more believers began reading and more relations were forged between various nationalities and cultures, Christians realized how disconnected the Catholic Church of their time was. After the fall of Constantinople, theologians from the East made their way to Western Europe with their scripture manuscripts written in Koine Greek, the original New Testament language. Those great teachers began lecturing in Western universities. They looked at the Catholic Church's Latin Vulgate, translated and arranged by Jerome in 382 AD with great concern. They went so far as to accuse the Catholic Church of altering the teachings of Jesus Christ on purpose to fit their doctrine. These scholars also viewed the Catholic Church as corrupt and shared that view with the public. Instead of evolving and adapting immediately in the face of public outcry for reforms, one could easily argue that the Church used its canon law, resources, and evolutions of her military religious orders to undermine the movement against her. On the other hand, it did not seem to matter that the Church failed because Christian theism still influenced the daily life of most individuals. Approaching the modern era, there increasingly became a distinction between Christianity as a religion and as a value system. Life had gotten better through the adoption of Christian teachings generally, and the lowest moral common denominators of society continued rising worldwide. Even with a substantially weakened Catholic Church, the principles of Christianity still made their way into a sort of general moral standard for society. There also became a rapid increase of subjectivism in organized Christianity outside the Catholic Church. That led to an increase in denominationalism in the Protestant movement that has continued into the present. As nation-states developed between the late 15th and 20th centuries and came to be defined by sovereign borders, flags, trade relations, unique resources, and slight cultural variants, Christian theism continued to evolve into the idea of religious freedom. Religious freedom in the context of governments was interpreted as personal and civil liberties. In that way, Christian theism influenced the systems of modern governments too. In forms of government such as constitutional monarchies or republics, personal liberty and free speech became viewed as natural rights preceding the formation and organization of government. The right to be alive, to have liberty of speech, spiritual development and mobility, and to pursue whatever each individual subjectively defined as happiness for themselves stemmed from Christian thought. During the modern era, the lowest moral common denominator had become and remained so high that over generations people lost the context about how society had reached its ends. In time, professors in Western universities looked around and assumed advances and propensity for understanding and applying complex divisions of labor were responsible for the relative peace and high living standard by comparison to other eras. This is one of the assumptions that accompany secular thought, where the credit for the high quality of modern life is placed, seemed to define one of the key differences between Christian theism and secular globalism and naturalism. The lesson highlighting this difference is present all through written history. The story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 comes to mind. God had commanded man to be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the whole earth in the wake of the great deluge. Instead, motivated by fear of another flood and lust for power, King Nimrod, the mighty hunter, identified by archaeologists on the Sumerians' kings list as Enmerkar, led a great building project at Eridu, an early iteration of Babylon on the plains of Shinar. Nimrod began construction of a great ziggurat where all people could gather as one in their great temple with their own forms of spirituality. God saw what they were doing. He came down and confounded their languages, thus compelling them to scatter and settle all areas of the globe as they searched for people with which they could communicate. The same thing happened time and again. Mankind thrived under Christian theism, but eventually turned to its own ways in some form of idolatry, often forgetting the Creator and honoring the creature. It happened to the Hebrews under Moses when man first received the written spiritual, civil, moral, and ceremonial law. Man fell into a pattern of disintegration with God, repented, and over and again. Today, mankind has done something similar to that of the Old Testament accounts. Humanity has created complex frameworks and nomenclature to identify processes and create meanings. Like previous civilizations, the people at the academic and institutional level of most disciplines end up using their rigid system of analysis to analyze that which created it, limiting itself to a small framework of understanding, and the writings of predecessors with the exact same limitations. This system eats up critical thought and squashes all but a few theories that fit the desired cultural narrative, whether for state or an institutional church. Overwhelmingly, those theories today tend toward naturalism. There has been an increasing awareness among average people of the trap inside which the secular worldview places people. Ironically, it seems to be the development of the spirit that opens one's eyes to the true goings-on in the world. This fact, along with power's tendency toward corruption, has led to shattered trust in anything institutional, including, in fact, maybe especially the institutional church, which seems a stronger proponent for secular naturalistic principles than anyone. The global social push, declining Christian theism in the United States, may have already declined it to the point of no return. Now it would take a dramatic and nationwide shift in the way Christianity is viewed and practiced to have an effect. Moreover, the fact that such a restoration would have to impact every level of society makes its chances stark. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you on the next installment as we continue our discussion about the future of Christianity. You can buy my book, Just Tell Me the Truth About the Future of Christianity, on paperback for only $7.99 at Amazon. The Kindle version, $3.99. You can also get my other books, Just Tell Me the Truth About the Holy Land Crusades and Shipwrecked in the Land of King Tobacco, the first Washington family immigrant to America. Thank you, and I look forward to talking to you next time.